His was the most costly difficulty in ancient history and the one that destroyed more empires than adversary forces ever accomplished. Not strategy, not bravery, not even leadership. Currency, or more precisely, the capability to keep compensating the individuals holding the weapons. Empires didn't collapse because they lost confrontations. They collapsed because they couldn't afford their forces anymore. And when the compensation ceased making sense, loyalty evaporated faster than ideology ever could. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where currency, authority, and history intersect. And nothing exists as straightforward as it appears. Before financial institutions, before income taxes, before central authorities or government obligations, every empire confronted the same brutal inquiry. How do you keep hundreds of thousands of armed individuals fed, equipped, and loyal year after year? Soldiers don't fight on principles alone. They fight because they expect something in return. Security for their families, status, territory, or cold, hard compensation. And once forces ceased being temporary militias and became permanent institutions, conflict transformed into a payroll difficulty. Ancient states couldn't print currency at will. They couldn't operate permanent deficits. If the treasury ran dry, there was zero lender of last resort waiting in the wings, which signified every empire had to anchor its military authority to something genuine. Metal pulled from the earth, territory taken by force, or labor extracted from conquered populations. These frameworks weren't abstract. They shaped how societies were organized, who bore the burden, and who compensated the price when elements went incorrect. Zero empire comprehended this better or pushed it further than Rome. At its height, the Roman Empire maintained a force of roughly 400,000 individuals spread across 3 continents. That wasn't a fighting force. It was a standing institution. Every soldier expected regular compensation, retirement benefits, and in many cases, territory after service. This wasn't optional generosity. It was the expense of keeping the empire intact. Rome's borders didn't hold because of patriotism. They held because soldiers were compensated reliably, at least at initial. The backbone of Roman military compensation was silver, not guarantees, not paper, actual metal. The denarius, Rome's standard silver coin, became the engine of imperial authority. Soldiers were compensated in it. Taxes were collected in it. Exchange depended on it, and the legitimacy of Roman authority was stamped directly onto its surface. But silver doesn't appear out of thin air. Rome required vast quantities of it, and that requirement quietly dictated the empire's expansion. The conquest of Hispania, modern Spain, wasn't merely about prestige or security. It was about access to some of the richest silver mines in the known reality. These mines didn't merely enrich Rome. They financed its legions. The empire quite literally dug its force out of the ground. As long as silver flowed, the framework operated. Soldiers trusted their compensation. Merchants accepted Roman coins. Taxes relocated efficiently through the framework. The force enforced order, protected exchange routes, and ensured that silver kept circulating back to the state. It was a closed loop of authority, currency, and force. But geology possesses restrictions, and eventually Rome began to feel them. By the 2nd century, the easy silver was gone. Mining became more expensive. Military campaigns grew costlier. The empire's borders expanded faster than its revenue foundation. And instead of confronting the structural difficulty, Roman leaders selected the oldest financial illusion in history. They diluted the currency. The denarius still appeared the same. Same stamp, same authority. But slowly, quietly, the silver content was reduced. A little copper here, a little alloy there. On paper, soldiers were still being compensated the same quantity. In reality, their purchasing authority was shrinking. At initial, zero individual noticed. Then prices started rising. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods. Soldiers complained that their compensation no longer covered their requirements. So, the state raised wages utilizing more debased coins, which pushed prices higher, which forced taxes upward, which squeezed farmers and urban workers who possessed zero leverage to negotiate their income. Inflation didn't announce itself as an emergency. It crept in as a series of modest compromises, each one defensible, each one necessary, and together they hollowed out the framework. The Roman force adapted faster than civilians. Soldiers began demanding bonuses. Emperors who failed to compensate were replaced, sometimes violently, by those who could. Loyalty shifted from the state to whoever controlled the treasury. Military authority ceased serving Rome. Rome began serving its military. Meanwhile, the individuals compensating the genuine genuine expense possessed zero say in the matter. Farmers were taxed more aggressively. Exchange became unstable. Savings lost worth and confidence in the currency eroded. What began as a clever workaround to a resource constraint became a slow-motion transfer of wealth from the population to the armed state. There's a quiet irony here. Rome didn't fall because it abandoned silver. It fell because it depended on it too substantially. When the metal ceased flowing, the illusion of stability collapsed with it. By the 3rd century, the denarius was almost pure copper. Soldiers were no longer reliably compensated in currency at all, but in food rations and territory grants. The economy fragmented, confidence evaporated, and the empire that once conquered the Mediterranean with coins stamped in silver began unraveling under the weight of its own payroll. If there were a gold medal for financial denial, Roman policymakers would still be on the podium. But Rome wasn't unique. It was simply early, and the configuration it revealed would repeat itself across history in different forms, under different banners with the same outcomes. Because once you comprehend how an empire compensates its force, you comprehend who truly holds authority. And once that framework starts to strain, collapse isn't a matter of if, only when. When Rome's silver-based framework began to fracture, it didn't invent a novel solution. It fell back on something older, more brutal, and far less stable: territory, loot, and guarantees of future reward. And in accomplishing so, it revealed a truth every empire eventually learns the hard manner. If you can't compensate your force with currency, you compensate it with expansion. And expansion never lasts forever. Long before Rome confronted that dilemma, other empires had already constructed entire military frameworks around it. The Assyrian Empire was one of the earliest and clearest examples. Its force was feared across the ancient Near East, not merely for its effectiveness, but for its purpose. Assyrian soldiers weren't compensated primarily with salaries. They were compensated with conquest itself. Plunder, captives, and territory were the reward. Cities that resisted weren't simply defeated. They were stripped, deported, and reorganized to feed the Assyrian conflict machine. This wasn't random cruelty. It was economic design. The Assyrian state didn't require to sustain a complex monetary framework because conflict funded itself. Each successful campaign replenished the force, rewarded loyalty, and reinforced the terror that made future conquests easier. Violence wasn't a byproduct of the framework. It was the framework. But there was a catch. When expansion slowed, the incentives collapsed. Soldiers accustomed to reward through conquest possessed zero patience for restraint. And when the empire could no longer feed its force through victory, it was consumed by rebellion, fragmentation, and internal collapse. The same reasoning appeared centuries later in the early Islamic caliphates, though in a far more structured form. Here, soldiers were compensated through state stipends funded by taxes imposed on conquered territories. Territory taxes, exchange levies, and religiously defined responsibilities flowed back to the center where they were redistributed to the military elite. As long as the empire expanded, revenue grew. As long as revenue grew, soldiers remained loyal. But when borders stabilized and conquest slowed, the framework strained. Administrative expenses rose, tax burdens deepened, and the political unity that expansion once masked began to fracture. Growth wasn't merely encouraged, it was required. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, China was constructing a completely different solution. One that relied less on currency and more on organization. Under the Han Dynasty, the state maintained massive forces without relying exclusively on coinage. Instead, it mobilized society itself. Taxes were compensated not only in currency, but in grain, cloth, and labor. Peasants were required to serve periods of forced operation, constructing roads, supplying granaries, transporting goods, and supporting military logistics. Soldiers were fed directly from state-controlled stores. Campaigns were planned around supply lines rather than treasure chests. The framework was efficient, centralized, and remarkably resilient, but it came at a human expense that rarely appears in heroic histories. Entire populations lived under permanent responsibility to sustain a force they would never join and a frontier they would never observe. It operated because the state possessed the administrative authority to enforce it. When that authority weakened, the framework unraveled merely as surely as Rome's silver economy accomplished. And then there were empires that compensated their forces not with currency, territory, or grain, but with individuals. The Aztec Empire possessed zero standing salaried force in the modern sense. Warriors fought for status, honor, and the right to extract tribute. Conquered cities were forced to deliver food, textiles, raw materials, and captives on a regular schedule. These compensations sustained the capital and rewarded the military class that enforced the framework. This wasn't chaos. It was bureaucratic. Tribute lists were meticulously recorded. Campaigns Campaigns were organized to maintain fear and compliance rather than territorial expansion. The force functioned as both enforcer and tax collector. But this framework was brittle, and when tribute ceased flowing, the political structure collapsed almost instantly. The empire possessed zero financial buffer, zero surplus mechanism, zero manner to adapt when extraction failed. Different civilizations, different instruments, same underlying truth. Forces are never compensated in abstraction. They are compensated with something genuine: metal, territory, labor, or existences. And whatever that something exists terminates up shaping the entire society beneath it. This is where the past starts to feel uncomfortably familiar. Modern states like to believe they resolve this difficulty. Currently, forces are compensated with budgets, obligations, and balance sheets. Salaries arrive digitally. Equipment is financed through long-term contracts. Conflicts are funded through deficits instead of conquest. But strip away the language and the structure hasn't transformed nearly as substantially as we pretend. Military spending is still treated as untouchable. When budgets tighten, social programs are debated. Defense budgets are protected. Inflation still quietly shifts the expense of that spending onto the population. Obligation replaces tribute. Central authorities replace silver mines. And the burden still falls on individuals who never voted on the framework that governs them. The instruments evolved, the reasoning didn't. Inflation currently functions the same manner coin debasement accomplished in Rome. It permits states to meet responsibilities without openly raising taxes. It transfers purchasing authority away from savers and wage earners. And it disproportionately protects those closest to the source of currency creation. Nothing states stable framework like requiring invisible mechanisms to fund the most visible force on Earth. The most dangerous illusion isn't that history repeats itself. It's that we believe we've outgrown it. Empires don't fall because they lose conflicts. They fall because the frameworks that compensate for force become unsustainable. When the expense of maintaining authority exceeds the society's capability to bear it, collapse doesn't arrive as a single occurrence. It arrives as erosion. Confidence initial, then stability, then cohesion. This is why comprehending economic history isn't academic trivia. It's financial self-defense. Because if you don't comprehend how currency flows toward authority, if you don't observe who gets compensated initial when frameworks strain, and if you don't recognize inflation, obligation, and extraction for what they exist, then history doesn't require to repeat. It will simply relocate forward, and you'll feel the outcomes without ever observing the cause. If this provided you a novel perspective, hit subscribe. History possesses the answers. I'll demonstrate you where to look.